The book of Judges ultimately fills in the greater narrative within the Bible that people need a king and savior. Specifically, Judges begins following the death of Joshua. Joshua was a God-fearing man and a great example of somebody to emulate in the Bible. Under Joshua's divinely inspired leadership, and more importantly, God's divine intervention on Israel's behalf, the people of Israel were able to conquer the majority of the Promised Land. That said, there were still some lesser kingships and settlements which God had commanded Israel to purge in order to not absorb the culture of Canaan. This culture included immense amounts of sexual promiscuity, slavery, and child sacrifice, among other more than problematic norms. In order to overcome these nations, God was with Israel in every battle as shown throughout the book of Joshua. God would remain with the Israelites, but they would continuously turn from him. The book of Judges thematically explores the consequences of these behaviors on people's lives. Judges chapter 1 begins with the people of Israel seeking God's direction. God does not give them a central leader like Abraham, Moses, or Joshua, but instead directs the tribe of Judah to go out and clear their allotted land. In response, Judah does go out, but they immediately begin backsliding by requesting help from the Simeonites rather than trusting in God to deliver the Canaanites into their hands. Despite the lack of full faith, Judah and the Simeonites defeat some Canaanites and Perizzites, including one king mentioned directly by the name of Adonai-Bezek. Once again, the Israelites backslide in their faith by absorbing the customs of the Canaanite culture by essentially incapacitating Adonai-Bezek by cutting off his thumbs and toes when God directed them to clear the land of the Canaanites rather than keep them as trophies in which they could boast. Judah also ends up partially razing Jerusalem but does not fully clear the city as it is never fully conquered until David's kingship. In verse 13, we catch a glimpse of the first judge listed in the book. It's also important to note that this is likely a reminder of what already occurred in the book of Joshua. In the conquest of Judah's lands, Caleb requests help in taking some lands known as Debir. He promises to give up his daughter Aksah in marriage to whomever is successful in taking this land. Othniel, the first judge and Caleb's nephew, is successful in conquering Debir, so Caleb gives his daughter Aksah to Othniel in marriage and gives them their own land. Aksah even requests that Caleb give them water rights, so Caleb grants them springs of water. Judah and the Simeonites then take a city called Zephath and give the spoils of war over to the Lord through the good's complete destruction. Then they go on to temporarily take the cities of Gaza, Ashkelon, and Ekron. It is important to note that these are later retaken because it becomes home to the Philistines, the nation of the infamous Goliath. Finally, the tribes of Judah and Simeon failed to drive out the people in the plains because of their lack of faith in God when they see that the Canaanites there had armored chariots. We then move on to the Benjamites. All that is written of this tribe is that despite Judah's help, they failed to finish the job and drive out the Jebusites from Jerusalem. The tribe then ends up living amongst the Jebusites there. Then the Josephites are mentioned in their attack of the city called Bethel, which was previously called Luz. In this attack, they see a man and he gives up vital information about the city to the Josephites and is spared. He then proceeds to build a city under the original name of the city that was just taken by the Josephites. The following tribes listed, Manasseh, Ephraim, Zebulun, Asher, Naphtali, and Dan, failed to drive out the Canaanites in their respective lands. Some pressed the Canaanites into forced labor, while some even lived amongst the Canaanites despite the Lord's commands. The tribe of Dan didn't even just fail to definitively win, they were forced to leave their territory by the Amorites, a Canaanite tribe. One major implication of Judges chapter 1 is how Othniel's story points to Jesus. While all of these events are historically real, God often uses people to show common themes that point to Christ. Othniel's story points to Christ because he defeats Caleb's enemies, and through this he obtains Aksah as his bride. As Othniel defeated Caleb's enemies, his story can show how Jesus did this to an even greater extent in defeating God's enemies of sin and death. Jesus Christ took on our true enemy, our own sin and death, through living a perfect and sinless life. He then gave himself up to be sacrificed, and though he knew no sin, he became sin and took upon himself the wrath of God that we rightfully deserve. Through this, he perfectly paid off our sin, gave us life, and made us co-inheritors of his kingdom. He is the Messiah, the ultimate and perfect judge. Through defeating sin and death, Jesus obtained us, the church, as his bride. All of the tribes in this chapter showcase forms of backsliding, some more blatantly than others. Much like how nobody just wakes up and decides to live their life in sin, Judah, for instance, backslid more subtly by not giving God their full trust to defeat the Canaanites for them. Comfort in sin begins slowly, but it is important to catch it as soon as possible. I challenge you to take a second to pray and ask God to reveal where you may be subconsciously warming up to the idea of sin. If you have thoughts, questions, or concerns, leave a comment below the video. I plan on continuing to make more videos like this in the future and eventually with a set schedule. For now, feel free to subscribe if you want to follow along this series.